Good morning to everybody. Thanks for joining today to this Geotheroom webinar. It's a webinar series that is being organized by the IGCP 636 project from the International Geoscience Project supported by the UNESCO. You can find the recordings of past sessions on our YouTube channel. I will write it down later into the chat of this session. Today, our invited speaker is Emily from Cascade Institute. I had the opportunity to meet her a couple of years ago when we organized the annual meeting of this project in Portugal. And now she's working in the Cascade Institute. And she will talk today about regulatory guidelines for geothermal development in Canada. This kind of experience can be a guide also for other countries around the globe that want to foster the geothermal industry. And so, Emily, it's a pleasure to have you as our guest today. So the floor is yours. I would like to thank also Jasmine, that will be in charge of the questions at the end of the talk, since I need to leave before the end. Thank you to everyone for joining today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Daniela. And thank you to the UNESCO IGCP for hosting this talk. Like Daniela said, I think even though I did this work with a lens of trying to develop regulations across Canada, I think it is directly applicable to the learnings are directly applicable to any of the international jurisdictions. There we go. Oh, hang on. I'm destroying my screen sharing. Give me 1 second. Okay. Let's try this again. Okay, there we go. So I just want to start off by thanking my two co-authors who are research associates with the Cascade Institute. Princess Castellan is with Princess is a master's, just defended her master's and is applying for her PhD with Simon Fraser University in British Columbia. And Stephanie Cordovas is with Waterloo University in Ontario. And they contributed a ton of the research to this report, and I could not have done it without them. So the other point is that the title of this report, Groundwork, is exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to lay the groundwork for geothermal regulations across Canada. And like I said, hopefully with applicability globally. So for today's presentation, I'm going to be explaining why I did this. So I'll tell you a bit of a story from my experience in industry and why I think regulations are so important and so critical for getting geothermal projects off the ground. I'll walk through what I've identified as the typical components of most regulations, what's going on in Canada right now, some global case studies, which is the backbone of the research and where the guidelines and recommendations come from, and then what we're going to do with this. I'm hoping this report isn't the end of the line for this. We have plans for how to implement some of these findings. So, story time. As I'm sure most of you know, geothermal has a very high risk profile at the start of projects. When you're drilling to identify your resource, when you're doing that initial exploration, that's where the majority of your cost is, but also where the majority of your risk is. As the project develops, the risk gets lower and lower. So one thing that can add to that issue is complex, uncertain, or complicated regulations. So why did we do this work? Why are regulations important? Well, first of all, you cannot develop a geothermal project without regulations in place. There needs to be a pathway forward to develop any sort of infrastructure or industry project. And then lack of regulations can cause an incredible level of uncertainty that already adds to this front-end risk that geothermal projects experience. So the Alberta #1 project is the project I worked on before I was employed at the Cascade Institute. And this project kicked off with a government funding grant in 2018. And it took them over 2 years to finally get a permit to drill a subsurface well for geothermal. And there was various reasons for that, but that 2-year delay caused them to lose some of their private funding that they had lined up, and ultimately caused the project to be stalled. I don't know what the status of the project is right now, as I'm no longer working there, but I have not seen any development since I left. So basically this project, which had excellent momentum at the start, was stalled because the Alberta jurisdiction, the province of Alberta in Canada, did not have geothermal regulations in place at the time. And as soon as they applied to develop a geothermal project under their existing oil and gas regulations, the government paused so that they could take a couple years to build geothermal regulations because of the key differences between the two. So this really inspired me when I moved to Cascade, and my mandate was to help get the geothermal industry off the ground in Canada and help Canada realize its geothermal potential. I saw the lack of regulations across the country as a huge barrier. I'd seen what this could do to projects, how that stall could affect not only the level of risk, but then the level of investment you get because of that increased risk. So this is why I started this project last September. So I'm just going to give you a brief sort of flavor for what is going on in Canada, because this is more of an international audience. Canada has an immense geothermal potential. Most of it is concentrated in Western Canada. So you'll see all of the warm, hot colors on the western side of the country. Those are primarily Canada's volcanic provinces and our warm to hot sedimentary basins. The rest of the country has potential with next generation technologies and for shallower ground source heat pumps. So there is potential across the country, but you're going to have to customize the technology you're using and the use you're getting for your geothermal energy countrywide. So there's one caveat. None of that can happen if we don't have regulations in place for development. So I'm going to walk you through what the key pieces of regulations are, and then I'll show you the status of what Canada's regulations look like right now. So the key components of geothermal regulations, all subsurface regulations, oil, gas, water, geothermal, are all based on 3 pillars. And I'll walk you through each of these in turn, but basically it's resource ownership, resource definition, and resource tenure. And like I said, that's applicable across all types of resources. There's also some additional considerations that regulations need to have in place, and we will touch on those towards the end. So first is resource ownership. Who owns the subsurface geothermal resource? In lots of places, this could be the government. It could be the surface land owner. It could be an interesting combination of the two. The next piece is, how are those geothermal rights granted? Are they granted by auction? Are they granted by a lease? Do you have full ownership? There's lots of questions to answer around that. What is the lease size? And to what depth in the subsurface? This becomes important if there's other subsurface resources in the area, like oil and gas, critical minerals, hydrogen, carbon storage. So you want to make sure that there's a strong understanding of, if you do get rights to geothermal resource in the subsurface, what does it include? What does it not include? And then finally, when you come across those other resources, are you allowed to double dip? Is multi-commodity extraction permitted? Can you cascade your uses? If I'm already pulling geothermal brine out of the subsurface and it happens to have lithium in it, can I also produce that lithium? So that's the first piece of regulations, is geothermal ownership. The second one is definition. So what are you actually able to produce? What do you have rights to? Is the resource defined as pore space, heat, fluid, energy, all of the above? As we walk through the global examples that I have, you'll see a flavor of each of these, and I'll try and discuss some of the benefits and issues that each of those different methodologies can have. Um, is the energy naturally occurring or human-made? There's been a lot of work done in Canada about looking at solar-assisted geothermal storage. The Geologic Survey of Canada is working on this right now in the high Arctic. So would a geothermal regulations include stored heat? So that's an important question to answer. Does that energy occur at the surface or in the subsurface? In lots of countries, we see geothermal resources tied directly to hot springs, which is the surface expression. Whereas throughout Canada, our surface water and our subsurface water are handled very differently. So, and then finally, the last piece of the definition is what can that geothermal energy be used for? The last piece is geothermal tenure, and I'm going to give you guys an example on the next slide. But basically, it's how are the stages of geothermal defined? What can you do for development in each stage, and what permits are required during those stages? And how long is ownership or rights for that resource granted? So the key pieces of geothermal tenure, typically geothermal projects go through 4 stages. So exploration. Is there a viable geothermal resource? This usually includes surface geophysical evaluation, maybe the drilling of a small diameter thermal gradient test hole, and usually this ends with a geothermal resource assessment. The development is usually completing the work that's necessary to capture the resource. So this is drilling full-size production and injection wells. This is starting the construction of the surface facility. This is doing long-term testing so that you can do the full engineering design of that surface facility. And this is looking at the full economic geothermal project evaluation. The third stage is typically operations. This will be the longest stage. This is making sure that your resource is being harvested and produced in a responsible manner. So you're not seeing early drawdown of the resource. You're not seeing pressure declines. It's being operated in a safe and responsible manner. And the final piece, which is really important, but I think has become more important recently, and that's decommissioning. So the decommissioning is when you're returning that geothermal site back to its original condition. So this is your wellbore abandonment, this is your surface reclamation, this is your remediation, putting everything back the way it was. And this is something that we've seen more and more countries working to adopt, and I'll talk a little bit about Canada's approach to this. So on the back end of those sort of 3 key pillars, there are a few other key pieces to geothermal regulations, and that's permitting and timelines. What permits do you need to be able to develop a geothermal project, and how long does it take for those permits to be granted? What fees and royalties are associated with the production of that energy? And then liability management. So this is ensuring public safety. This is ensuring the long-term reclamation of those projects. This is ensuring that everything is put back the way it was, and that the responsibility for putting everything back is with the developer and does not land on the government. This is something in Canada, we have a long legacy of oil and gas development. And there's quite a few oil and gas wells that we now call orphan wells because they no longer have an owner and they've become the property of the government. And the job of cleaning up these wells has fallen to public funds. So in order to avoid that, a lot of jurisdictions in Canada have started implementing this liability process so that those wells, the responsibility of cleaning them up stays with the developer and does not end up on the public to pay the bill. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Canadian regulations and give you guys a sort of groundwork for what we're looking at here in Canada and why I've evaluated stuff the way I have. So in Canada, the surface landowner does not own the subsurface. So if you have a house, you do not own the rocks beneath you. all you own is up to the bottom of the water table. So private landowners in Canada do not own the subsurface. And we call this, another word for this is split estate. So because those surface rights do not extend into the subsurface, the line that they draw is the bottom of the freshwater table. That's where the definition of surface versus subsurface is for most of Canada. So because we have this split estate, our federal government is actually the one who owns the subsurface below the base of the freshwater. So we call in Canada, being a legacy, I can't remember the word for what we are, same as Australia, we have the king on our money. It'll come to me later. We call it the crown. So our federal government and provincial governments are referred to as the crown. And so the interesting thing, though, is that our federal government has actually given the provinces and territories, which is the equivalent of states. So they've given the provinces and territories in Canada the jurisdiction to be the ones responsible for all the subsurface resources that are in that crown land. So the provinces and territories are the ones who own all of the resources that occur below the freshwater table in Canada. And they're the ones who are going to be responsible for developing the regulations to govern them. So they're also the ones who benefit from the fees and royalties. I do have one note in here about Indigenous lands. Canada has a deep and complex history with our Indigenous peoples, and this is an incredibly complex situation that I don't have the expertise to unpack, but it does seem to look like it's happening on a nation by nation basis based on what that nation has negotiated with the provincial or territorial government. So this is something that all developments need to be acutely aware of when they're working on looking at any subsurface resource development in Canada. So this is the status of Canada's provinces and territories. So there are 13 provinces and territories in Canada, and currently only 3 of them have geothermal regulations in place. Thankfully, 2 that have regulations in place are the ones where we have most of our resource in the West, which is British Columbia and Alberta. And these 2 jurisdictions do have experience permitting projects. So they have projects permitted. There is one hybrid operating geothermal project, which operates hybrid with an oil field in Alberta. And BC is looking, based on the signals they've put out recently, it seems like they're looking to get some geothermal projects permitted there as well. So there are also a couple jurisdictions that are working on developing regulations, and that's the Yukon Territory and Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan's an interesting case, and I can talk more about it in the next slide, but even though they don't have geothermal regulations in place, they have a permitted geothermal project. And then finally, there's a few jurisdictions in Canada that have geothermal mentioned in their government policies. Quebec has stated that they are in support of geothermal as an energy source, as has the Northwest Territories. They've included it in their future energies plan, but there's no regulatory pathway forward for actually developing a project at this point. The rest of the country in the dark brown is lacking in any statement of policy or regulations. Nova Scotia, which is the NS on the far east coast of Canada, is an interesting case. They do have geothermal regulations in place. They do have a permitted heat project. It's a flooded mine called Smejkal Mines. And for them, they have basically grandfathered it in under the mineral rights. So I can talk a little bit more about each of these, but I just wanted to showcase on this slide that these are the provinces that either have, Saskatchewan has a project permitted, and the other 3 jurisdictions have regulations, but I wanted to really highlight the differences between all of these. So Alberta and British Columbia and Saskatchewan are all neighbors, and they have incredibly different approaches to how geothermal is being regulated in those provinces. And so it is complicated and confusing for anybody who's trying to develop a project with and what that's looking at scaling up across jurisdictions. So Alberta uses their definition is based on any heat below groundwater. British Columbia is only heat over 80 degrees Celsius, but includes surface resources as well as subsurface resources. Nova Scotia is heat in any fluid phase, so steam, water. Saskatchewan doesn't have a definition, but like I said, has a permitted project. Saskatchewan's a really interesting case because they give out their rights based on the pore space. So you lease rights to a section of pore space and you own everything in it. Potash, oil and gas, critical minerals, geothermal energy, all of it. So that's why they've been able to permit even though they don't have regulations in place. So really what I want to highlight here is that even though we do have a few regulations, there is some inconsistency between them. So when I started this project, my hypothesis was that if I looked at the countries who were already producing a bunch of geothermal energy, that I would be able to figure out some best practices for geothermal regulations. Now, I'm a geologist by trade, so I understand that geology probably plays a huge key role in the fact that these countries have immense geothermal power production. Because most of them are located on great resources. But when I looked at this map and I looked at this list, I realized that there was a significant number of countries that are on the ring of fire or sitting on a great resource that don't have immense geothermal production. So my hypothesis was that policy and regulations must play a key role in whether or not a country has developed their geothermal resource. So my hope was that looking at these countries' experiences, we should be able to learn from what they've experienced, whether it's good or bad, in the sense of their geothermal regulations. So I'll start off, I'm going to walk you briefly through each of the countries. And I'll tell you sort of what my key learning and interesting story was from each of them. So the United States is incredibly complex, and I can't even pretend to fully understand all of the subsurface regulations in the US. But I do know that there are certain states, it varies by state, who owns the subsurface resources. And it varies by state if that's the surface landowner, if it's the state government, if it's the municipality that the resource is in. So looking through that, it was incredibly complex. So I looked at where most of the production for geothermal is happening in the United States. And the majority of the production for geothermal energy is on federally owned land. So not unlike Canada, this is federally owned surface land, but also federally owned subsurface land. And it's governed by the Bureau of Land Management. So what I did was I ignored all the states and their complexities and just focused on the regulations that the Bureau of Land Management has in place. We do see that regulatory inconsistency between the states and the federal lands has probably slowed geothermal development. And this is probably the reason why there's only most of the geothermal power is being produced on the federal lands, because they have regulations in place and they have consistent regulations in place over that giant swath of land. So, but doing my research through the United States, I think my biggest takeaway was the fact that when I read California, which is the second most geothermal power production, when I read their geothermal regulations, and then I looked at Alaska's, I realized that Alaska's were actually based off of California's. So Alaska's geothermal regulations were essentially templated off of California's, and California's regulations weren't that dissimilar from the Bureau of Land Management. So this validated a bit of my hypothesis that, okay, we could maybe use template regulations to create as much consistency as possible when we have so many jurisdictions with various ownership. So I think my biggest learning from the US was that hopefully going forward in the future, template regulations can be used across jurisdictions, and this would bring consistency and decrease scale-up risk for developers. The next country we looked at was Indonesia. Indonesia has had some really interesting developments in the last few years. They introduced some early stage automation to their permitting process, and this is your permitting process for getting the environmental approvals prior to getting the subsurface rights awarded. And they used automation and AI to drop their regulatory approval process from 18 months to 5 days. So this isn't a drilling permit. This is just the initial screening. They still have staff and personnel that are looking at this stuff on the back end, but for some of those simpler processes that would have lain on someone's desk, they used automation to decrease it down to 5 days. This is also one of the few jurisdictions that I found that actually had that post-operation or reclamation or decommissioning phase of geothermal regulations. And the interesting thing was that the feedback from most of the developers in Indonesia was that knowing what they had to do to reclaim their site post-operation helped them build that into their initial project planning and budgets, helped them include that in their timelines, and actually increase the certainty of the project. So I thought that was a really interesting learning from them. The Philippines, I was really fortunate that my co-author, Princess, on this, she's actually from the Philippines. And so she was able to help me a bunch to work through this country's geothermal regulations. Also, I should note, I forgot to say this at the start, I only speak English, so I relied on English translations of pretty much all of the regulations. So if you disagree with anything that I've said, refer back to the initial primary language regulations, because I was relying on English translations. So the Philippines was, like I said, I had quite a bit of help having someone who was from the Philippines. But the interesting thing about theirs is that the Philippines hasn't had to change their definition of what a geothermal resource is in that country since 1967. Every other country I looked at when I was doing this study had policy reform and regulatory reform, or was looking at it as a way to help advance geothermal energy in their country. The Philippines, originally, when I looked at it, I thought the fact they hadn't changed was maybe a hindrance to them. But then I realized they hadn't had to change because they've been very smart about how they had defined the geothermal energy in their country initially. So having that very, very clear definition really helped them. And the other piece is that we're seeing all this policy reform because the geothermal industry is changing so fast. New technologies are coming out so quickly right now. The old regulations aren't applying to them. The way the Philippines defined there was technology agnostic enough that they haven't had to change it. So I thought that was a really key takeaway from the Philippines, that their definition has been consistent because it doesn't use a temperature, it doesn't use a technology, it defines it as energy. Turkey is an interesting case study. They have had a significant amount of public backlash in Turkey because of issues around re-injecting geothermal brines into the subsurface. And this is something the country has struggled with immensely over the last few years, and they've actually been working very hard to mitigate this. So the government has actually funded educational campaigns, and they have beefed up their environmental regulations to ensure that developers have to dispose of or re-inject geothermal brines responsibly. So for me, my key takeaway from Turkey was the fact that having that effective public communication really reduces project opposition, because they've seen an acceleration in project development timelines because the public is not opposing and pushing back on development over the last few years. New Zealand was a very interesting case study, I think, for Canada, because they have a thriving geothermal industry, but they actually have integrated their Indigenous peoples into that industry. So there's lots more details in the report, and we did do a bit of a case study on this, but basically they've developed their geothermal resources in a way that respects the cultural value of the geothermal resources to the Maori. The Maori have a partial ownership stake in it because it is their unceded resource. So it's been very interesting to look at the way that New Zealand has handled geothermal development, because they've done it sort of hand in hand with the country's indigenous populations, which is something that I don't see very often and something I think that Canada could learn a lot from. So that's why I've got that a thriving geothermal industry can still honor indigenous resource claims and still be able to function. So it's not one or the other, it's something that should be happening in tandem. Kenya. Kenya's interesting because they have primarily driven their geothermal development through public ownership. So the government of Kenya is the one who funded most of the initial exploration for the resource in Kenya. The government has owned the Kenyan power developer that has developed most of the projects. And I think this was maybe a bit of a hindrance in the middle. I think in the beginning, having that public funding up front did an amazing job of de-risking the resource, proving that it was there and proving what it can do. Once they had the industry stood up, there was maybe a lack of investment from private equity, but they have now opened it up to private investment as well. And they've seen an increased interest from private industry coming into the country to develop geothermal resources. So this isn't so much a regulatory finding as it is more of a policy finding, but the fact that the government was the one responsible for basically unlocking this resource, I think was something that was a big learning. And it's not unlike what we've seen happen in the United States or in Mexico, which Mexico's later in the list, where we've seen the government put money into exploring and defining the resource so that private industry can then come in on the back end. And they don't have as much risk associated with them. So if you remember that big risk graph from the start, the government's the one that's taking on most of the risk, and then private industry is more comfortable coming in. So while this isn't a specific regulatory finding, it was still something that I think was really important to notice. So Mexico, like I said, they've used state funding as well to unlock their resource. But something I really liked about Mexico's regulations is that when a developer applies for a geothermal permit of any sort within Mexico, there is a set timeline the government has to respond. And they have to respond within that timeline. And depending on what type of permit it is, it varies between only 10 and 45 days. So if you apply for an environmental permit, it's closer to 10. If you're applying for a drilling permit or a construction permit, it's closer to 45. But that's still a really quick turnaround compared to some of the issues we've seen in other countries. I've heard stories from the United States of it being 18 months to 2 years to get a permit. We saw the example from Alberta, where I'm from, where it was 2 years to get a drilling permit for the project I was working on. So 10 days to 45 days sounds pretty good. The nice thing is, though, too, that when you have this mandated government decision timeline, you have a clear timeline for the project. You know that when you put in your permit application, you're going to get a response back in 10 days. That lets you start ordering long lead items for drilling. It lets you start designing your power plant if you're working on the feed stage. This gives you that certainty as a developer for what you need for costs and timelines. So the next one was Italy. Italy is similar to Canada in the fact that each of their individual states is responsible for the geothermal development. This has made it really complex to develop geothermal in Italy because not only do the states own their geothermal resource, but so do the municipalities. So each little town actually is responsible for developing their own geothermal resource. And then you have the state around them. So this has led to some confusion and conflicting regulations when you get to the edges of cities or within the suburbs on the outskirts or within the smaller towns surrounding. So this has added some complexity, and I think it's not unlike some of what I'm seeing in Canada. So my learning from this was basically don't do this. It was that regulatory consistency across jurisdictions decreases that risk. So the more consistency you can have within the country, the less risky it is for developers to come there. Iceland, now I know they're pretty low on my power list, but they produce an immense amount of geothermal heat. And Iceland, I think, probably has the most experience in regulating geothermal energy production. They have a single independent geothermal specific regulator. So there is a arm's reach government body within the country of Iceland that is responsible for all geothermal development. It's interesting because in Iceland, if you own the surface rights, you also own the subsurface rights. So every private landowner in Iceland owns their own geothermal rights, which can make it complex, but there's a significant enough publicly owned lands that they've still been able to develop. But having that dedicated regulatory body has made it so that there is a path and there is no confusion. And the permitting process on private and public land is exactly the same. So even if you own your own land and you want to develop your geothermal resource, you have to go through the exact same permitting and regulatory process as you would for the public lands. So having that consistency and that singular body overseeing everything has provided clarity and predictability in Iceland and has allowed them to develop to the geothermal's like leader that they've been in heat and more so in power as they move forward. Finally is Japan. Japan is a split ownership where the surface owner of the geothermal resource, the hot springs owners, they're called onsens, they are different than the subsurface resource owner. And it's got complex because the hot springs are very important to the Japanese culture. And they are very concerned that if subsurface geothermal projects are developed, that's going to impact the surface geothermal hot springs. So there's been a conflict between the subsurface power geothermal developers and the surface geothermal spa and heat users. I could not find any real clear regulations. I really struggled to find much information on Japan at all. I've spoken with a few people, so I have some anecdotal notes, but it was really hard to find any written experiences or case studies from this country. But I do know that having that lack of clarity between surface owners and subsurface owners and having no clear regulatory pathway has really slowed development in the country and has sowed conflict between the two. So it's more one of this is a proceed with caution piece. So this is a summary of my findings, my key learnings for each of the countries. So I've touched on each of these as we've walked through, and they're here and they're captured in the report as well. But I did look through and use these 10 countries to build the framework of what I think works and doesn't work, and what we could learn for making new regulations from them. So on to some of the guidelines that I've put together. There was sort of 6 best practices from looking at these 10 countries that I learned. You need to precisely define the resource. People need to know what they have rights to produce, what they don't have rights to produce. Otherwise, this creates an issue with conflict, with overlapping resource claims. You have to precisely define that resource. But it's also important that that resource definition be technology agnostic. Geothermal technologies right now are changing so fast. Even just in the short time that I've been in this industry, I've seen an incredible shift from conventional geothermal to more of these next generation new technologies. So having a geothermal definition that is agnostic to what technology you're using to extract the energy will make it so you don't have to reform these regulations further down the road. Establishing an efficient, clear, and consistent permitting process and permitting requirements. The more companies and developers know about what's expected to them, the lower the risk is to them and the easier it is for them to find funding. And regulations are there to protect the public. So ensuring that these regulations are in place but are clear helps us keep the public safe and allow developers to move as quickly as possible within that safe environment. Most countries I looked at, I don't know if you noticed on the sort of summary slides, but there was a maximum amount of acreage one company could own. I had never seen this before because Canada doesn't have this rule. And I don't know if that's because of our huge land mass or if that's just the way our rights are, but most countries had a maximum number of acres or hectares that a individual developer could own to avoid resource monopolies. So I thought that was really interesting, and I thought that was probably a good practice going forward. Setting realistic timelines for tenure and allowing for flexibility well avoids, so there's speculative resource grabs in there. What I mean by speculative resource grabs is when we see a kind of a company purchasing or leasing subsurface rights when they don't maybe have an intention of actually developing them. They're just buying them in hopes that they can sell them for a higher price later to somebody else who would like this. And we've seen this happen in a couple of the Canadian jurisdictions. And this has led to municipalities and communities not being able to develop their own geothermal resource for heat or power because a private firm has purchased the rights out from under them already. So we want to avoid that. But we also want to make it accessible enough for developers so that they can see a market here. So there's a balance between the two of them, between setting realistic timeframes for how long a developer can hold the rights versus letting them hold on to them indefinitely and potentially have that at the detriment of the surface user. The final one, which I think is probably the most important, is that early public outreach to build trust and support. Many projects have been derailed by the fact that the public has found out about it too late or found out about it in the wrong way. And a little bit of outreach and community engagement at the beginning would have led to the project moving a lot smoother. So based on all the learnings from those international case studies and following those guidelines that I just laid out, I actually came up with some template ownership model, definition, and tenure for geothermal. And while I had Canada in mind for this, I could see it being applicable to many other countries. And so in Canada, remember, the Crown or the federal government owns the subsurface resources, but our provinces are responsible for making the regulations and allowing development of them. So my hope was that if I could build template regulations similar to what I'd seen California and Alaska do, that I could have some consistency across the country. So these are tailored to that split estate where the subsurface owner is the public owner or the government. But like I said, I hope that these would be applicable in other jurisdictions as well. So for the resource ownership piece, I was actually using resource ownership. Again, I use the Canadian definition where it's below the base of our groundwater. So that's the freshwater line in Canada. We do have that mapped across most of the country. And so when I was looking at this, I actually included everything. So the ownership or the rights for geothermal energy would also include critical minerals. They would also include hydrogen. They would also include whatever is dissolved or entrained in the medium you're using to harvest the geothermal energy. My hope was that this was technology agnostic. This would allow for both closed loop or open loop or hydrothermal or energy storage techniques in the subsurface. It allows for those cascading revenue streams. So if I'm already producing the brine and there's lithium in it, then I can also harvest the lithium. And I did not put a specific temperature on this because in Canada, we are so cold at the surface. For us, geothermal energy could mean temperatures as low as 17 degrees to 20 degrees for heating. So I didn't want to isolate it only to power production. I wanted to look at deep heat production as well. And the definition that I've used was I'm defining geothermal energy as energy. So it is it is the energy. So it's not the fluid, it's not the specific heat, it's not the change in heat, it's the actual energy that's held in the rock. So, and this energy is renewable and continuously replenishing. And this is, for me, this was a really abstract concept. My work history is primarily oil and gas. And to be producing something that I can't physically hold in my hands has taken a bit to wrap my head around. But I think looking at geothermal as energy, that's part of what keeps it technology agnostic. And that's part of what should allow for development of both heat and power. For this definition, I also included it, I used Saskatchewan's definition because they've been able to permit a geothermal project without having regulations. And when I read through it, I found that very interesting. So in order to eliminate competition between resources and in order to allow for that multi-commodity extraction, I defined this geothermal energy as within the pore space. So that rights that you would own would be a depth slice of rock over a certain horizontal acreage, and you would own whatever is in the pore space, whatever is in that rock. So this would mean that if somebody owned the geothermal rights, somebody could not also own the oil and gas rights. We've seen some resource competition issues popping up in some Canadian jurisdictions, and so this would eliminate that. But this only works if there aren't other resource regulations in place already. So in Alberta, for example, there's already a very robust oil and gas regulations set in place. So this wouldn't apply or be able to work as well in a location like that because they already have regulations and ownership around the oil and gas rates. So when I was tailoring these, I was thinking more about the jurisdictions in Canada that don't have any regulations or have very dated regulations for mining and oil and gas and water so that they could sort of encapsulate all of the subsurface resources under one umbrella of regulations. For the model resource tenure, remember when we were looking at the definitions at the beginning of the presentation, I had 4 stages. I actually moved the exploration and development phases into 2. I went back and forth on this a lot of times, and I'm still not 100% sure this is the way that works best for both industry and public, but this was my best attempt. So the development permit would also include the exploration period. And I did this primarily because that site characterization piece and exploration piece that we're seeing is becoming less important with the new geothermal technologies that are coming out. So next generation geothermal, closed loop, and enhanced geothermal technologies, those are removing some of the site characterization risk, some of that exploration risk. So having the development and exploration tenures lumped together allows for them to move a little bit more seamlessly between resource discovery and the start of resource development. The operations and decommissioning, very similar to what we've seen pretty much everywhere else. Operations is basically just producing the resource, and I think that would be as long as it can go, as long as it's being done responsibly. Decommissioning, I have it as site specific because that is going to have to be an environmental survey done at the start, and then the site will have to be reclaimed to the same standing it was at the end of decommissioning. So that was going to be a site specific piece. So I've just got a quick list. I'm just looking at the time and realizing I'm a little bit short, so I might just skim through these. But I have a list of what would be permitted during each of these tenure phases. Again, development is there a resource and how much energy can we get from it? Operations is producing the resource responsibly and making sure that we're not overproducing it to the point where it's drawing down and it's no longer renewable. And decommissioning, again, is just cleaning it up and putting everything back the way it was originally. So there's a few additional guidelines that we talked about at the start. I have a few rough guidelines around what I think would work well for Canada. In Alberta, where I am, you can get a drilling permit for an oil and gas well in 15 days. Why can't geothermal do the same thing? So I think that we should be able to use some of the expertise Canada has in regulations and permitting, and move forward with that. The fees and royalties, I saw in a lot of jurisdictions that royalties collected on geothermal were either non-existent or were delayed until the projects were making a profit. And that's partially to combat that really high risk profile we saw in this first few slides, where most of the capital investment is upfront on geothermal projects. And then the other really important thing to note is that fees should be funding the body that is responsible for implementing these regulations, but they should not be for a profit. Royalties would be in place if there was to be a profit, because it is a publicly owned resource. There should be a public benefit from its development, and that's where royalties come in. But fees should be minimal and only enough to cover the person's salary and work that's going into approving these projects. Finally, liability management. I told you the story of the orphan wells in Canada. There's a few different approaches to working on liabilities. So basically, you can either do a bond or a security deposit, but essentially it needs to be addressed so that there's enough money to cover the well's reclamation and remediation and the project going back to its environmental standards if the company goes out of business, but it needs to not be detrimental to the company's development either. So we've seen some jurisdictions that will require 100% liability deposit up front, but that could be millions of dollars, and that could be really detrimental to a project that is already lifting most of that capital investment at the start. So there needs to be a nice balance there where we have that public protection, but we also have the ability for the developer to move forward. So I'm pretty much done. Next steps. Overall, like clear, consistent, and efficient regulations are going to be key to advancing geothermal development. They minimize uncertainty, they lower investment risk, they give projects a proven path forward. Canada has a great resource, and we have an opportunity to actually be a leader in this technology. We have a ton of expertise from oil and gas. We should be moving forward with geothermal, using our resource and using our knowledge. We can't do that without regulations. Regulations are the first step. So the next step for me is hopefully to build template regulations for the 10 Canadian jurisdictions that do not have regulations in place, so that we can hopefully help them adopt or adapt something that's fairly consistent across Canada. So I just wanted to thank my co-authors again, and Cascade Institute's institutional partner is the Royal Roads University on Vancouver Island. And these are the funders who made this research possible. And I will pop this up. If you scan the QR code, you can get to the full 100-page report. But I just want to say thank you again for having me, and thank you to the IGCP for all of their support.
Great. Thank you, Emily, for this nice presentation. That was really interesting. We saw that you have a lot of material, and I guess you could have speak for an hour more on that regulation, but that was really interesting, and I guess not easy to make a relatively short presentation on this topic. So we'll go on with questions. Here in our classroom, there's about 8-10 people. Microphone is on, so I may take some questions from the classroom, but if there are other people online that would like to ask questions, I think you can either raise your hand, and I think I can unmute you, and you can ask your question, or you can write the question in the chat. So,
and I'll apologize for going a bit long. If you have questions we don't get to, just feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to talk about regulations anytime.
Yes, okay. And I guess we can take a few minutes for the question. If there's nothing yet, I would like to ask one. Maybe to start with. In Canada, we have geothermal and heat pump industry moving moving forward and installing system all across the country in all major Canadian cities. These shallow geothermal heat pump systems are not regulated in terms of ownership, right? If you own the piece of land or the surface, you have the right to drill a well and install a heat pump system to heat and cool a building on that piece of well, as long as you respect environmental regulation and you protect the groundwater. Because sometimes there are regulations in the province to protect groundwater resource from geothermal heat pump system. But these systems are becoming more and more popular. And in cities, some of those systems are getting deeper and deeper. And those shallow systems, which used to be like, well, that are 100, 200 meters deep, are now moving into systems with wells that have, I don't know, what I've seen so far is up to 500-meter depth. And now where these systems are moving outside of below the depth of the groundwater resources, these systems use heat, so which deep geothermal should regulate, right, the heat resources. So how can we go and have a regulation that could combine these two types, like shallow and deep geothermal, knowing that the shallow geothermal system are getting deeper and deeper, and that we want this regulation to be technology agnostic? What would be your recommendation on that?
Yeah, I struggled with this question, Yasmin, because when I was looking at the regulations in Canada, you're right, the geo-exchange or ground source heat pumps are pretty much covered under Canada's environmental water well drilling or building codes. And those vary by like municipality, let alone province. So I didn't dig into those because there were so many different ones across every jurisdiction. I do know that Ontario does have regulations for ground source heat pumps installation. They have a industry association that installers have to be certified by the industry association to install a ground source heat pump in Ontario. The cutoff I was using was that base of groundwater. And I think across a lot of Canada, anything below a few hundred meters would fall into these regulations that I've put in place. And I certainly had when I started the project, certainly had more of a thought around geothermal regulations for power production, but quickly realized they needed to include heat as well. So I think the regulations that I've put in place are definitely more flavored towards those deep installations. I'll look at them through the lens of the geo-exchange and ground source heat pump. I would be interested in hearing what your thoughts are, Yasmin, on if you think they would apply. Because I'm even thinking borehole heat exchangers as well, right? So I think the fact we've defined the resource on it by energy, and we've looked at the ownership grant of rights for pore space, I think they should apply if we were to adopt them to ground source heat pumps as well. But I would be very curious to talk more with you about that, because I think that's your area of expertise.
There's a gray zone right now, and it's a bit complex, and I'm not too sure how that should be regulated. And I think for the shallower system, like less than 100, 200 meters depth, like that's clear.
Yeah.
There's separation between the two types of technology we're looking at. But for those deeper systems like standing column well, which is kind of an open loop system, and with wells that can be up to 500 meters, they're currently regulated or loop with the geo-exchange technology, right? Yeah. So they follow that same regulation, but we're getting really close to deeper geothermal, right? What would be the difference with this and 1 kilometer well that feed a district heating system, for example? It's not a lot, right? It's only a few meters and different. So how to distinguish both and regulate both? Knowing that maybe in a few years, both type of system will be in operation in some provinces. it's still a bit of an unknown. I'm not sure how to proceed, but and knowing that I think the geo exchange industry is happy not having an ownership regulation. Right? The geo exchange industry is moving forward without any ownership regulation.
Yeah.
And this would have allowed the installation of many systems across the country. So I think we don't want to have an ownership regulation for those type of projects. But I think it would make sense for one. So how to combine both or how to define the boundary is not simple. Yes.
Yeah, one of my colleagues told me that if I've made the developers kind of unhappy, and I've made the government kind of unhappy, and I've made everybody just equally unhappy, then that's probably the right balance. If everyone is, yeah. So it is really complex, and you're right. I really struggled with if I should put a like specified depth on the regulations. And I think in some places it would make sense to have an overarching all geothermal heat or power at any depth is captured under this regulation. But again, like you said, you don't want to deter the development of industry either by overcomplicating something that they're already accelerating in. So it is really tricky to make everyone equally unhappy. Never make them all happy, just make them equally unhappy.
All right. I guess that's a good answer. Do we have other questions from the audience? Yes, Benjamin, the classroom question.
I was just wondering because there was a recommendation towards multi-commodity rights, the subsurface and the pore space. I was just wondering because there's already regulations in Alberta, and you're saying that's why it would be difficult to implement these rights in that province. But would there be any other limitations in expanding areas and exploring the subsurface towards having that multi-commodity access?
So I know this is really complex. So Stephanie, my co-author, has looked at the carbon sequestration rights in Ontario. And that's where some of these comments have come from, is with discussions with her. And I think the key is that this is why I say I want if I make template regulations, they would be adapted or adopted, because I think it's going to be province and territory specific. Because if I look at the Northwest Territories, they have a little bit of oil and gas, and they have a lot of mining. So they have a really robust set of mining regulations that you would have to work around for the geothermal regulations. But they don't include most of the critical minerals or helium or hydrogen in their mining regs. So there maybe is room to sort of use the geothermal regulations as a catch-all for everything that isn't already regulated. But yes, the idea for the multi-commodity extraction and regulations and having those multi-commodities captured within that pore space that's being regulated under these proposals, it's only going to work if there's nothing else in place. And I did realize that, and it was a bit of a simplification. So like in Alberta, I can own the oil and gas rights over a zone, and then somebody else can own the geothermal rights over a zone. And I'm fully expecting there to be some very interesting legal conflicts going forward around that. So I think it's something we'd have to work with each jurisdiction on. But like Manitoba maybe doesn't have robust regulations on much beyond nuclear disposal and a few minerals. So maybe there's an opportunity there to use something more overarching. So let's get a jail-free answer, but it is going to be jurisdictional dependent. And I think as much as I want to idealize this one big overarching umbrella of regulations, I do realize I'm going to have to work with each province individually and what they already have in place.
Yeah, I guess the problem is regulation are being developed based on interest also, right? For example, in Quebec right now, there's no regulation on CO2 sequestration, hydrogen exploration, or the geothermal.
Yeah.
It would be nice to have a regulation that would look at all these potential subsurface application. But right now, government is prioritizing some field like CO2 sequestration because some projects are moving forward. we'll probably see that before any deep geothermal regulation. So,
well, and I think that was one of the things I really liked about the like pore space rights model, was the fact that then if you wanted to use that pore space for sequestration, you would have the right to. If you wanted to use that pore space to produce the fluids that are carrying the geothermal heat, you would have the right to. So that, like, I was attempting to make something that would sort of include more use cases of the subsurface, but definitely with a focus on having geothermal be the primary use. But yeah, I know the carbon sequestration piece, like I said, that's my co-author is a specialist in Ontario's subsurface sequestration regulations. So we've had many conversations about the complexities of multiple users and multiple rights holders in the subsurface, and the potential conflicts that are going to come from that, and ways to make everybody unhappy, equally unhappy. And I think the pore space model was the clearest. So it would create the least amount of conflict between subsurface users, and it would incorporate most resources. And Saskatchewan has that right now. That is how Saskatchewan gives out potash rights, how they give out oil and gas rights, how they give out critical mineral rights. Like, you own those rocks and whatever is in them. And so there was a bit of elegance in the simplicity of that.
yeah, and I guess it would work unless it's closed. You're not looking at pore space, but just something that you can hold in your hand, which is right.
Yeah, and that's why even though the ownership was pore space, the definition was energy. So like I'm trying to cover both bases, but I think you can understand the like complexity of this, and like there's a reason no one's done this yet. It's really hard.
It is. There's so many different avenues, right? So it's kind of to have the perfect legislation.
Yeah.
All right, any more questions from the audience online, maybe? If not, I guess we can end this talk. Thanks a lot, Emily. That was really interesting. I think we had a good turnout, also about 12, 15 people online at most, and about 10 people in our classroom. So for a July talk, I think it's a good turnout, and that was really interesting, really instructive for us. So thank you, Emily.
Perfect. Thanks again so much for having me. And yeah, feel free to reach out if you have any questions or suggestions in the future. And the report's up on the Cascade website. And yes, note to self, do not publish a report the last week of June. Thank you so much, Yasmin.
Thank you. Have a nice day.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye to everyone.